Well, hello everybody. This is December the 8th, and this is Douglas Frazier Today. Going to have a little different show today. As I've stated in the outline of this program, we hit all sorts of areas of life. Well, today we're celebrating the life of a very famous American, but I would say probably a very famous person known around the world, and that is John Glenn. He was one of the very first pioneers to go into space. He was a hero of great magnitude. I can remember in the 1950s, the late 1950s, when the space race began and the Soviets, Russia, they launched Sputnik, and already the United States felt as though they were behind in this new frontier. John Glenn was one of those men from even his childhood who had a great desire to leave the earth and fly. It was said in a book, apparently, that he wrote, I heard this on a news item, that when he was young, his parents said he would run around the yard with his arms outstretched as though he was an aircraft. If there was an aircraft flying in the sky over his head, and this is in the early days, the late 1920s, 1930s, because you see, he was born in 1921. He passed away today. He was 95 years old. But you see, from that early age, he had a vision. He had a passion. He had a desire to be one of those that would go beyond the confines of the earth and fly in an aircraft. That was his passion. In World War II, he was a Marine pilot that carried also into the Korean War. He retired from the United States Marines as a colonel. And then he began his career into NASA. He held, and still holds as far as I know, the world's fastest flight, where they covered across the United States in a special aircraft at just over 3.5 hours. From coast to coast. He was a test pilot in those times. Then he got into being chosen to go into the astronaut program. He became the first man to orbit around the Earth. And if you can imagine, in those early days, and I remember growing up, and where I lived in California, we were not that far from Vandenberg Air Force Base, where missiles were tested in the late 50s, early 60s, and often we could see the contrails open the atmosphere of a missile launch. But it's said that once John Glenn joined the program, they were down at Cape Canaveral, and they watched the launch platform, an Atlas missile or rocket, as it took off, flew up to whatever the altitude, and then it literally exploded over their heads. I'm sure that they sat there and wondered, or stood there and wondered. They said, "You're going to send us up in that?" And in 1962 was the year after Alan Shepard and I think Gus Grissom, if I remember right. This is from the early 60s that these two went up, basically just a launch up into the atmosphere and then back down and recovered. So John Glenn was chosen to be the first to orbit the Earth. I believe he entered that period of his life. He was 40 years old. So on that historic day, he was supposed to make 5 orbits of the Earth. But apparently at the control center at either Cape Canaveral or Houston, there was a reading that there was a problem with the heat shield that was to protect him as he came back through the atmosphere back to the Earth. And so because of that, they weren't sure whether that shield was going to stay attached to his orbiter, the Mercury project, that orbiter. And so they cut his mission short, and instead of making a scheduled 5 orbits, he only made 3. He knew that there was a challenge, and yet he faced the risk of, I'll just put it this way, coming through the atmosphere and the chance of becoming what I'll call a crispy critter. Because if that heat shield did not stay in place, the orbiter would simply disintegrate coming through the atmosphere at the speed it would. But it made it. He landed out into the Atlantic. I can remember watching that bobbing satellite out in the Atlantic as a Navy aircraft carrier stood and launched helicopters. They sent out the divers into the water, opened the door, and took John Glenn out of the capsule that he was in. Big smile on his face. And they said it was interesting. He knew that there was a challenge coming down. But they said they could hear him on the radios whispering the battle hymn of the Republic. He was a man of great honor and character. He was considered to be a hero, a true hero of the United States. And as a result of that, there was great parades across the United States for his accomplishments. There was great recognition, and it was said that President Kennedy decided, because he was such a very important person to the future of the nation, that basically he grounded him from any other future space flights. I can just imagine a man of his background, all of the flying that he had done, all of his desire to go and to capture the moment and see the greatness of the glory of God as he circled around through space, perhaps on that first orbit, and said, "Look, I finally made it. I have this is just awesome." But yet, President Kennedy thought it wise to ground him and to protect him as a hero of the United States, and really, I would say, a hero of the world for what he had accomplished on that first flight. Because in those days, it was a risky business. I can remember not only the greatness of those days, those early days of the pioneers into space, but I can also remember being in the hospital in 1967 while I was in basic training for the Air Force and watching TV as the Apollo 1 had a fire on the ground, and three astronauts were killed on that day, sitting on the ground. So there was a lot of tense moments in the early days. And then, of course, we've seen over the years the Challenger, and also there was one other of the space shuttles that blew up, and they lost the whole crews. I can remember the one very distinctly because I had just had eye surgery and was sitting at a friend's dinner table. Actually, we were having lunch, and it was flying over this part of North Texas, and we heard an explosion in the air. We stood outside and looked, and we could see the debris flying through the air, coming down, and it spread over a wide area across North Texas. But you see, John Glenn led the way. He went on later to serve as a senator from Ohio. But his flying days were not over because he got to go back into space when he was in his mid-70s to do some testing on the space shuttle having to do with aging. So here it was some 30 years later, 30 plus years later, that he went from going from 3 orbits and a very dangerous landing opportunity, if you will, to where he went up in one of the space shuttles and did testing in his mid-70s. He didn't have to do it, but I'm sure that there was just great joy within his heart that he had the opportunity to go around. And this time I thought about it, almost like he was cruising and made many orbits for the amount of time that the space shuttle was going around. And he could truly get a picture of the stars and the moon and the sun and the planets that they could see from outer space. And he says, I'm sure he could say something, I've finally seen what God showed me even as a young person, because he was a man of faith. And you see, we honor this man for what he did, but he gave us also dreams and visions that our young people need to understand, that if you've got a dream or a vision and have a passion and you don't give up, you can see great and mighty things take place in your life. So I hope if you are a parent, wherever you are listening to this, because I'm getting listens from literally around the world, in Russia, in the Ukraine, in the Caribbean islands, in India, in Myanmar, in Japan, in Australia, several states here in the United States. If you've got children, get some books, look on Wikipedia, look wherever you can find about the history of John Glenn and maybe some of the other astronauts, and what it was like for them to go out as pioneers. He represents the last of the original group of astronauts from the United States. He was the last of those living of that original grouping of astronauts. I think it's also quite interesting that he passed away one day after we celebrated Pearl Harbor Day. Because if you remember, he did serve in World War II as a fighter pilot, and then again carrying on into the Korean War. He was well decorated for his service to the United States in the military. He was well decorated and honored in the astronaut program and as a senator from the state of Ohio. So we have lost a hero of the United States, and I would say a hero of the world that they can look up, and here was somebody, a man that was dedicated to showing what could be done when men put their minds together, their passion together, and then work to see it happen. So as you listen to this, once again, take the time and thank God for a man that was willing to literally risk his life so that we in all nations around the world would see the benefits that have come from the space program, not only here in the United States. It was the battle between the United States and the old Soviet Union during the Cold War days. But you see, we've seen astronauts go up, I believe, from India, from Pakistan, from Japan, China, of course, Russia. They have all gone up and done things for the service of mankind. We've seen things that benefit our daily lives come from the experiments that were done in space, from the technology that was used on many of the orbiters or the space station or the various platforms that were used. And now we're in a different realm where now we're even having, instead of the government or the military sending up rockets, we're seeing businesses, civilian businesses, launch and move us further into the desire to go beyond where no man has gone before. You see, that became kind of a Star Trek, Star Wars type of saying. But really, it came because Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and yes, John Glenn said, we're going to go farther than man has gone before. So this is closing out. Just my thoughts, my personal observations of growing up during that era of the early space days and seeing things with my own eyes happen, of being a part of that early history. Again, it goes back, I think, to the challenge of John Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you. And I'm speaking to any country, any person from any country that is listening to my voice in this recording. But ask what you can do for your country to make a difference and add value. We will see you again. This is Douglas Allen Frazier signing out from Douglas Frazier Today. the 8th of December, 2016.